history remembers the Soviet victory as a triumph of unity and sacrifice. Yet newly examined archives reveal how this memory was carefully engineered, rewritten to glorify leadership, conceal losses, and transform tragedy into legend. Through censorship, selective heroism, and mythic storytelling, the war became both a shield and a weapon of ideology. Let's uncover the 10 facts that history never told in full. 1. The war as a unified people's struggle for generations. Soviet citizens were taught that the Great Patriotic War represented the ultimate expression of national unity, a moment when workers, peasants, and soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder under a single purpose to defend the motherland. This version of history appeared in textbooks, monuments, and commemorative films, portraying a harmonious society united by sacrifice and love of country. Yet records from wartime institutions reveal that this unity was more a creation of propaganda than a reflection of social reality. The notion of a perfectly cohesive nation emerged as a deliberate construct of Stalin's information apparatus, designed to conceal internal fractures that could weaken morale. The Soviet Union entered the war burdened by years of repression, famine, and forced collectivization, leaving rural populations distrustful of Moscow's authority. Reports from military commissars in 1941 described widespread confusion and resentment among conscripts, many of whom associated the regime with hardship rather than liberation. As the German invasion advanced, panic spread among both civilians and soldiers, forcing the state to rely on coercive measures to maintain order. Order No. 227, issued in July 1942, forbade retreat and authorized summary executions for desertion, illustrating that unity was enforced through fear. Thousands of blocking detachments were deployed behind the front lines to shoot any soldiers attempting to flee. Political officers embedded within military units monitored loyalty, ensuring that ideological conformity replaced voluntary cooperation. At the same time, Soviet cinema and newspapers projected an image of collective resilience, showing factory workers producing weapons with smiles and farmers sending grain to the front. These images masked the grim reality of shortages, mass evacuations, and widespread hunger. In occupied territories, some civilians even greeted German troops as liberators before the brutality of occupation reversed their stance. Despite these fractures, post-war propaganda transformed the suffering of millions into proof of unbreakable solidarity. The idea of a unified people served an essential political function after 1945, legitimizing the Communist Party's authority during Reconstruction and suppressing memory of dissent. By converting fear and endurance into patriotic harmony, the Soviet regime reshaped the psychological memory of the war itself. What endures today is not the reality of division, but the myth of unity, a moral image that concealed the state's dependence on compulsion rather than consent. 2. Stalin as the architect of victory. Official Soviet history credited Joseph Stalin with the decisive leadership that brought victory over Nazi Germany, presenting him as the supreme strategist who foresaw every major development and guided the Red Army to triumph. Post-war propaganda elevated his image to near divinity, portraying him as the embodiment of courage, wisdom, and paternal authority. In truth, early wartime events demonstrated that his leadership was marked by misjudgment and authoritarian rigidity. When intelligence services warned of an imminent German invasion in June 1941, Stalin dismissed the reports as provocations, convinced that Hitler would not risk breaking the non-aggression pact. As a result, Soviet defenses were caught unprepared, leading to catastrophic encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, where millions were captured. After assuming full control of the armed forces, Stalin centralized decision-making, often overruling professional generals. Strategic blunders followed, including the failed Kharkov counteroffensive in May 1942, where over 200,000 Soviet troops were lost due to his insistence on attacking before reserves were ready. These failures were later erased from official histories, replaced by narratives of temporary difficulties overcome by Stalin's determination. When the Red Army began to recover momentum after Stalingrad and Kursk, propaganda retroactively credited Stalin's strategic patience for victories that had in reality been achieved by commanders such as Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky. The 1945 victory parade in Moscow cemented this image. Stalin received national worship while the generals who had led the armies were pushed to the background. Post-war films and literature portrayed him as the central hero of the conflict, replacing the chaotic, collective nature of the Soviet war machine with the simplicity of one man's vision. The transformation of Stalin from flawed commander to infallible savior served political goals, ensuring that the Communist Party's legitimacy rested on his mythic authority. Even after his death, this image endured in popular memory, symbolizing strength and order in contrast to the turmoil of the early war. The truth reveals that victory came not from brilliance at the top, but from the endurance of millions below, a reality incompatible with the cult of leadership that Soviet propaganda so carefully constructed. 3. The Soviet liberation of Eastern Europe. According to official Soviet accounts, the Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe was a crusade of liberation, the moment when oppressed peoples were freed from fascism by the selfless sacrifices of Soviet soldiers. This portrayal became central to post-war identity, presenting Moscow as both liberator and guardian of a new, just order. Yet archival documents and military directives reveal that liberation and domination were deeply intertwined. As Soviet forces entered Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states between 1944 and 1945, they were accompanied by NKVD units tasked with securing political control, identifying potential enemies, and establishing loyal administrations. Local resistance movements that did not align with Soviet ideology were quickly suppressed. In Poland, the non-communist Home Army, which had fought the Germans for years, was disbanded, and its leaders arrested or executed in 1945. Similar actions followed in the Baltic region, where mass deportations targeted landowners, clergy, and intellectuals suspected of anti-Soviet sympathies. Propaganda within these countries celebrated the Red Army as a force of friendship, showing images of soldiers distributing bread and raising flags of freedom, while concealing the imposition of Soviet authority. Orders issued by the Soviet command allowed the confiscation of industrial machinery, livestock, and raw materials, all transported eastward under the guise of reparations. In cities like Budapest and Prague, initial gratitude turned to resentment as Soviet presence hardened into occupation. Post-war governments installed with Moscow's support adopted identical slogans and iconography, ensuring that national histories echoed the Soviet version of events. Any expression of independent wartime suffering or resistance was labeled counter-revolutionary. For decades, commemorations of liberation reinforced this memory, silencing the experience of those who viewed 1945 not as freedom, but as the beginning of subjugation. The propaganda of liberation thus achieved dual purpose. It sanctified Soviet military prestige abroad and justified domination at home. By transforming occupation into deliverance, the Soviet Union secured ideological control over an entire region. What remained in the public mind was gratitude without choice, a selective memory that shaped Eastern Europe's identity for generations and concealed the moral cost of liberation under the Red Banner. 4. The heroic Soviet soldier without atrocity. The image of the Red Army soldier as an unblemished hero became one of the most powerful myths of Soviet wartime propaganda. Films, novels, and official histories depicted him as disciplined, compassionate, and morally superior to his enemies. This image served not only to inspire citizens during the war, but to define Soviet moral identity afterward. Yet wartime records and post-war investigations reveal a far more complex and human picture. During the final campaigns of 1944 and 1945, as Soviet troops entered German and East Prussian territory, discipline eroded under the pressure of vengeance, deprivation, and chaos. Internal military reports documented widespread looting, destruction of civilian property, and assaults. But these reports were suppressed under the strict censorship of the main political directorate. Commanders issued repeated directives demanding restraint, but the scale of the advance made enforcement nearly impossible. Some commanders tolerated excesses as a form of collective retribution for Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. This blurred the line between justice and revenge, transforming violence into an unspoken instrument of morale. Civilians in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia experienced the darker side of liberation, yet within the USSR, such incidents were never discussed publicly. Post-war films such as The Fall of Berlin, 1950, depicted German civilians greeting Red Army troops with gratitude, erasing any suggestion of misconduct. The official memory of the soldier became one of purity and virtue, reflecting the state's need to maintain a moral dichotomy between fascism and socialism. Only decades later, when access to archives improved, did military court records reveal the extent of wartime offenses. The revelation did not diminish the scale of Soviet sacrifice, but restored a sense of moral realism long absent from national memory. The myth of the faultless liberator simplified history into a tale of saints and villains, serving ideological clarity rather than truth. By confronting this myth, historians now portray the Soviet soldier as neither saint nor monster, but a human being shaped by total war, caught between vengeance, duty, and survival, a truth the Soviet state worked tirelessly to conceal. 5. The Great Patriotic War as an independent struggle. Soviet wartime and post-war propaganda insisted that the Great Patriotic War was fought and won through Soviet strength alone. According to this narrative, foreign aid played no decisive role, and the Western Allies merely benefited from Soviet heroism. This myth reinforced national pride and justified claims of moral superiority over capitalist powers. In reality, the Soviet Union depended heavily on Allied logistical and industrial support provided through the Lend-Lease program. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States and Britain supplied vast quantities of vehicles, aircraft, food, and raw materials that sustained Soviet operations. Over 400,000 American trucks, 13,000 tanks, and millions of tons of fuel and aluminum reached Soviet territory via Arctic convoys and Persian routes. These deliveries enabled rapid troop movement and improved supply efficiency during critical campaigns, particularly from 1943 onward. Soviet production was formidable but uneven, often disrupted by evacuations and shortages. Without Allied vehicles, Red Army mobility during offensives like Operation Bagration would have been severely limited. Yet this dependence was hidden from the Soviet public. Wartime newsreels credited all industrial output to domestic workers, while political speeches framed aid as symbolic rather than essential. After the war, as the Cold War deepened, references to Lend-Lease virtually disappeared from textbooks. The idea of self-reliance became part of Soviet national identity, symbolizing both resilience and ideological purity. Even veterans who remembered American-made Jeeps and canned meat were discouraged from speaking about them publicly. The suppression of Allied assistance served to isolate Soviet memory within a single self-contained triumph, a moral and strategic narrative that excluded cooperation. Only in the late 1980s did public discussions begin to reassess the scale of Western aid, revealing that nearly 10% of Soviet wartime supply came from external sources. This acknowledgement did not diminish Soviet achievement, but challenged decades of propagandized isolationism. By erasing the reality of international support, Soviet leadership transformed a global alliance into a solitary legend. The myth of independent victory reinforced the image of a nation that stood alone against fascism, a story repeated across generations to fortify national pride and sustain the illusion of total self-sufficiency. 6. The myth of Soviet industrial self-sufficiency. Post-war Soviet narratives portrayed wartime production as a miracle of socialist planning, claiming that domestic industry alone supplied the Red Army's needs despite invasion and displacement. Propaganda films and exhibitions celebrated workers forging tanks and aircraft in newly relocated factories, presenting the Soviet Union as a nation capable of sustaining total war through discipline and ingenuity. Yet economic records and logistical archives reveal that industrial survival depended as much on improvisation and foreign aid as on state planning. When the German advance began in 1941, nearly 1,500 factories were dismantled and moved eastward beyond the Urals in one of the largest industrial evacuations in history. This operation preserved vital manufacturing capacity, but came at immense human and logistical cost. Entire plants operated in tents or open fields during the first winter, and workers lived under extreme deprivation. Production losses in 1941 reached nearly 40% compared to pre-war output. Despite propaganda claiming uninterrupted productivity, records from the State Defense Committee show repeated shortages in steel, rubber, and aviation fuel. Allied deliveries through the Lend-Lease program filled many of these gaps, supplying raw materials, precision machinery, and locomotives critical to Soviet logistics. Furthermore, Soviet industrial reports show that the drive for production often ignored efficiency and safety, resulting in waste, accidents, and declining quality. Yet none of this appeared in wartime or post-war publications. Newspapers celebrated record-breaking shifts and heroic workers while ignoring declining output ratios. The image of unstoppable productivity reinforced the ideological claim that socialism alone could outproduce capitalism in war. After 1945, this myth became a cornerstone of Soviet self-image, used to justify economic centralization during the Cold War. Archival evidence, however, portrays an industrial miracle built on desperation, sacrifice, and international dependence. The real achievement lay not in flawless planning, but in the resilience of ordinary workers who endured near impossible conditions. The myth of self-sufficiency transformed economic struggle into ideological perfection, erasing the human cost that made survival possible and masking the global cooperation behind Soviet endurance. 7. The myth of the unbroken Soviet morale. Official Soviet histories depicted the population as unwaveringly committed to victory, unified in spirit, and unshaken by fear. Posters, films, and speeches described citizens as models of stoic endurance who never doubted eventual triumph. This version of morale became central to wartime propaganda, symbolizing moral superiority over fascism and capitalist individualism. Yet internal correspondence and NKVD intelligence summaries present a more fractured picture. During the first 2 years of war, reports recorded widespread panic, despair, and instances of fatalism among civilians and soldiers alike. Food shortages, evacuations, and the destruction of entire towns eroded faith in the state's promises. Between 1941 and 1943, authorities documented thousands of anti-government remarks, small uprisings, and attempts to flee conscription. To maintain discipline, the state relied on repression and censorship rather than voluntary enthusiasm. Military tribunals sentenced hundreds of thousands for desertion, while party propagandists were dispatched to the front to reinforce loyalty through speeches and ideological instruction. Religious faith, long suppressed before the war, re-emerged spontaneously among civilians seeking comfort, leading the government in 1943 to partially restore the Russian Orthodox Church's public presence as a means of moral control. Propaganda shifted accordingly, now presenting faith as compatible with patriotism. Wartime literature and cinema exaggerated heroism to conceal exhaustion, while morale reports were rewritten before reaching the upper leadership to preserve an image of stability. When the tide of war turned in 1943, morale genuinely improved, but its earlier fragility was systematically erased from memory. The myth of unbroken spirit remained a post-war fixture, reinforcing the idea that socialism had forged a superior moral character. Archival evidence instead reveals a population sustained by fear, hope, and necessity, not ideological conviction. By transforming ordinary endurance into ideological devotion, the regime created a narrative of purity that could not admit despair. The truth shows that Soviet morale was not unbroken, but repeatedly rebuilt through control and adaptation, a fragile unity hidden beneath the triumphant songs of wartime propaganda. 8. The myth of Soviet intelligence superiority. Post-war Soviet accounts frequently emphasized the brilliance of Soviet intelligence, claiming it foresaw enemy plans, infiltrated German ranks, and ensured victory through espionage and counterintelligence. This portrayal appeared in countless films and books, glorifying figures such as the fictionalized Soviet spy in Berlin archetype. In reality, the record of Soviet intelligence during the war was mixed, marked by early failures, internal mistrust, and later adaptation. Before June 1941, multiple intelligence agencies, including the GRU and NKVD, provided repeated warnings of a German invasion. Stalin dismissed these reports, convinced they were provocations from Britain. The failure to act on intelligence led to one of the most devastating military collapses in history. During the war, Soviet intelligence improved dramatically, but much of its success depended on deciphering German communications through captured documents and foreign assistance. British code-breaking at Bletchley Park and Allied intelligence sharing provided critical information on German troop movements, particularly before the Battle of Kursk. Inside occupied Europe, Soviet agents often operated without coordination, competing for recognition rather than sharing data. In occupied territories, local partisan networks provided valuable intelligence, yet many were left unsupported or sacrificed due to internal political distrust. NKVD counterintelligence focused as much on suppressing dissent within Soviet ranks as on neutralizing enemy spies. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were investigated for contacts with the enemy, often based on minimal evidence. After 1945, propaganda reinterpreted these activities as heroic espionage, simplifying the chaotic wartime intelligence landscape into a narrative of infallible foresight. Declassified records, however, reveal that Soviet intelligence became effective only after catastrophic lessons learned from failure and loss. The image of omniscience served to strengthen the post-war myth of a state always in control, one that could anticipate threats and outthink the West. The reality was one of improvisation, human error, and costly adaptation. This truth does not diminish the courage of Soviet agents, but restores proportion to their story, replacing legend with evidence and revealing intelligence as a mirror of the Soviet system itself, secretive, capable, and deeply flawed. 9. The myth of Soviet innocence in propaganda control. The Soviet Union consistently portrayed its wartime propaganda as purely defensive, a tool of morale, never manipulation. Official statements insisted that Soviet information policy sought only to strengthen resolve and expose Nazi lies. However, internal directives show that propaganda was one of the regime's most aggressive weapons, not only against the enemy, but against its own population. From 1941 onward, the main political directorate of the Red Army coordinated with the state censor, Glavlit, to produce uniform narratives that eliminated ambiguity. Losses were minimized or entirely suppressed. When the Red Army suffered encirclement at Vyazma and Bryansk, newspapers reported strategic withdrawals and tactical regroupings. Reports from the front were rewritten to fit ideological expectations, ensuring that the public perceived only steady progress. Photographs showing dead soldiers or destroyed towns were prohibited. Even letters from soldiers were censored, with mentions of hunger or disillusionment removed. The propaganda effort extended to occupied territories, where pamphlets in local languages presented the Soviet advance as liberation and promised autonomy that would never materialize. Foreign correspondents visiting the USSR were guided through staged tours of factories and collective farms to witness people's enthusiasm. Radio broadcasts celebrated victories weeks before they occurred, constructing a psychological timeline that ensured optimism. After the war, propaganda retrospectively reshaped events such as the Siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad into moral parables, omitting moments of despair, starvation, or failed command. The effect was to merge truth with narrative until they became indistinguishable. Unlike German or Allied propaganda, which was often recognized as such, Soviet messaging was internalized as historical truth. By claiming moral innocence in its information war, the state transformed propaganda into pedagogy, history written in real time. The revelation of these manipulations decades later demonstrated how deeply information control shaped not only wartime perception, but post-war memory. The myth of benevolent propaganda concealed a machinery of control so effective that even its victims came to defend its stories as truth. 10. The myth of the eternal Soviet victory. In the Soviet Union, victory in the Great Patriotic War became not a historical event, but an eternal condition, a permanent symbol of moral superiority and justification for state authority. Propaganda transformed 1945 into a living ideology, suggesting that victory had not ended but continued through Soviet achievements and global influence. Each May 9th commemoration reinforced the idea that the USSR alone had preserved civilization from fascism, with the people and the party eternally bound by triumph. Yet archival documents and post-war correspondence reveal that this perpetual victory narrative emerged from political necessity rather than collective pride. The immense cost of the war, over 20 million dead, destroyed cities, and a traumatized population, made triumph an emotional necessity. To prevent reflection from turning to disillusionment, the state reinterpreted suffering as glory. Military parades, films, and school curricula celebrated heroism while avoiding discussion of the human toll. As the Cold War began, the memory of victory was weaponized to legitimize Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and ideological confrontation with the West. Every scientific success, from nuclear weapons to space exploration, was presented as a continuation of 1945's victory. Veterans who questioned official memory, mentioning repression or unacknowledged losses, were marginalized as pessimists. The elevation of victory to sacred status removed the possibility of mourning. Grief was replaced by ritual celebration. By the 1970s, the war had become a civil religion, its imagery omnipresent in films, monuments, and education. The myth of eternal victory provided emotional continuity for a society scarred by hardship but dependent on pride. With the collapse of the USSR, this narrative fragmented, revealing how much of Soviet identity had rested on the sanctification of war memory. The truth, preserved in letters, diaries, and restricted archives, shows that victory was both triumph and tragedy, a foundation built on loss. The myth endured because it gave meaning to suffering, but it also silenced honest remembrance. In preserving victory forever, Soviet propaganda ensured that the war would never truly end, its lessons buried beneath the need for eternal triumph. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines how nations remember themselves. The Great Patriotic War was not only fought on battlefields, but in the pages that followed, where memory became a weapon and silence a form of control. If preserving this truth matters to you, subscribe and continue uncovering what history tried to forget.